I remember the exact moment my life changed forever. It was a Tuesday morning. The kind of morning where the sun comes up slow and golden, and the birds are singing outside the window, and for just 1 second, just one single, beautiful second, you forget that everything is broken. I was sitting at the kitchen table in the house I built with my own hands, not hired someone, not paid a contractor. I drove the nails, I poured the concrete for the porch steps, I painted every single wall in that house. And I was sitting there with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at a stack of papers that my wife's lawyer had delivered the night before. Divorce papers, 41 years of marriage, 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and now papers. My name is Harold James Mercer. I am 67 years old, and I am going to tell you something that very few people know. Something that my own family still doesn't fully understand, even now. I let my wife take everything. The house, the car, the savings account, the retirement fund that I had been building since I was 24 years old. The lake cabin we used to take the kids to every summer, all of it. I signed every single paper without arguing, without fighting, without even raising my voice, and everyone thought I had lost my mind. But I want you to stay with me, because what happened at that final court hearing, the day my wife walked in with her lawyer and her new boyfriend, and that big, confident smile on her face, that is a story worth hearing. Let me take you back, because to understand the ending, you have to understand the beginning. I grew up poor. Not poor like we couldn't afford vacations, poor. I mean poor like my mother made soup from chicken bones twice because she couldn't afford to throw them away. Poor like I wore the same pair of shoes for 2 school years and learned to stuff newspaper in the toe when the sole started separating. My father worked in a steel mill for 32 years. He came home every night smelling like metal and sweat, and he never once complained. Not once. He used to say, and I can still hear his voice when I think about it, he used to say, Harold, a man's character is not measured in what he gains. It's measured in what he does when he loses. I didn't understand that when I was young. I understand it completely now. I met Margaret when I was 23. She was 21. She was the most beautiful woman I had ever seen in my life. Dark hair, bright eyes, a laugh that made the whole room feel warmer. We got married in her mother's backyard on a Saturday afternoon in June. It rained for 20 minutes, and then the sun came out, and Margaret laughed and said that was good luck. For a long time I believed her. We had 3 children. Our oldest, Tommy, we called him, he's 40 now. Then our daughter, Patricia, and our youngest, Robert, who everyone calls Robbie. I worked 2 jobs for most of their childhood. During the day, I was a mechanic. At night and on weekends, I did home repairs for neighbors and anyone who needed help. I fixed leaky roofs. I replaced water heaters. I poured driveways. I built that house on Crescent Lane myself on weekends over the course of 3 years. Margaret used to bring the kids out on Saturdays with sandwiches and lemonade. Patricia would sit on the lumber piles and read books. Tommy would hand me tools like a little surgeon's assistant. And Robbie, little Robbie, he used to fall asleep in the wheelbarrow because the sun made him sleepy. Those were the best days of my life. I didn't know then that I was building a house for someone else to keep. You want to know how a marriage of 41 years ends? It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in pieces. Small pieces, so small you barely notice them until one day you look around, and you realize there's nothing left but the shape of something that used to be real. Things started changing about 8 years ago. Tommy married a woman named Diane. Now, I want to be careful how I say this because I don't like to speak badly about people. But Diane had a way of looking at things, at people, that was about what they were worth, what they had, what position they held. To Diane, I was just an old mechanic who smelled like motor oil and didn't know which fork to use at a fancy dinner. She started pulling Tommy away from family dinners, then from holidays, and somehow, slowly, quietly, the way fog rolls in, Margaret started spending more time with Diane. Shopping trips, lunches, and I noticed that when Margaret came home from these outings, she looked at our house differently. She looked at me differently. She started saying things like, "Harold, Tommy and Diane have a dishwasher that loads itself. Why don't we have one of those?" Or Diane said we should update the kitchen. "It looks old. It looks tired." I used to say, "Margaret, the kitchen works fine. We're not hurting." And she would go quiet. But not a peaceful quiet, a resentful quiet. Then Patricia's marriage fell apart. Her husband left her for someone else, and Patricia moved back home for a while. I was glad to have her, but Diane told Tommy that having Patricia around was bringing down the family's image. I'm not making that up. Those were the words, bringing down the family's image. And Tommy, my Tommy, who used to hand me screwdrivers on Saturday mornings, Tommy started keeping his distance from his own sister. That hurt me deeply, but I said nothing. I kept going to work. I kept fixing things. I kept building. Then 5 years ago, my back gave out. 30 years of physical work will do that to a spine. I had 2 surgeries and I couldn't work for almost a year. We had savings, so we were fine, but I noticed something during that time. Margaret seemed embarrassed by me. When Diane and Tommy would come over, which was rare, Diane would look at me sitting in my recliner with my heating pad and my reading glasses, and she would give Margaret this look. Like, "Is this really your life?" And Margaret would straighten up a little, smile a little too bright. Like she was apologizing for me. I saw it. I never said a word. 3 years ago, I found out Margaret had been talking to a man named Gerald. Now, I'm not going to dramatize this more than it was. I don't know the full story of what happened between them or when it started. What I know is what I saw. What I know is that Margaret stopped wearing her wedding ring to certain events. What I know is that one night I found a message on her phone from Gerald that no message should be. I sat with that knowledge for 3 days. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, the same kitchen table I'm telling you about now, and I said, "Margaret, I need you to be honest with me." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Harold, I haven't been happy in a long time." I said, "Why didn't you tell me?" She said, "Because you were always working, or you were tired, or you were fixing something for someone else. You were never really here, Harold." I felt like I had been hit with something heavy, because I had been working for her, for the children, for the family, and somehow, in all that working and building and fixing, she had decided that I was absent. I said, "What do you want to do?" She said, "I want a divorce." And I said, and I meant it, I truly meant it, I said, "Okay." Now here is where the story gets hard to tell. Because once Margaret said she wanted a divorce, something shifted in her, and in Tommy, and in Diane. It was like they had been waiting for permission to show me who they had become. Margaret hired a lawyer named Clifford Wells. Clifford Wells was the kind of man who wore cufflinks and talked louder than necessary and seemed to enjoy other people's pain just a little too much. He came to the house, my house, the house I built, and walked through every room with a clipboard, making notes. He looked at my workshop in the garage and said to Margaret, "All of this equipment. Has he kept records of purchase dates?" Like I wasn't standing right there. I said, "I'm right here." He looked at me like I was furniture that had spoken and said, "Mr. Mercer, I'd advise you to get your own counsel." Margaret did not look at me. Then Tommy and Diane came over one evening. I hoped, Tommy was coming to talk, to be my son for a few minutes. Instead, Diane sat down and pulled out a piece of paper and started listing assets. The car, the savings, the lake cabin, the retirement account, Diane said, "Dad, you should know that Mom deserves her fair share after 40 years. I said, "I know that, Diane." She said, "The house should go to her. She raised her children here. She has emotional ties." I said, "I built that house." Diane looked at me with this little smile. This smile that wasn't really a smile, she said, "and she lived in it and kept it and made it a home. That counts for something too, Harold." It was the first time my daughter-in-law had ever called me by my first name instead of Dad. I looked at Tommy. My son. My boy who used to fall asleep on my shoulder during long car rides, and who I taught to ride a bicycle, and who I sat with in the hospital waiting room for 6 hours when his first child was born. Tommy looked at the table. He did not look at me. I said nothing. Patricia called me that night. She was the only one who called. She said, "Dad, you can't just let them take everything. Fight back, please." I said, "Patty, don't worry about me." She said, "Dad, you built that house. You built everything. They can't just." I said, "Patricia, trust your father. Okay, just trust me." She was quiet. Then she said, "I love you, Dad." I said, "I love you too, sweetheart." And I hung up and sat in the dark for a long time. Robbie, my youngest, lived across the country in Oregon. He called a few times. He offered to fly in. I told him to stay put. He had 2 little kids and a job, and I wasn't going to upend his life. But Robbie and I talked on the phone. Long talks, and I told him quietly, carefully, what I was planning. He said, "Dad, are you serious?" I said, "Dead serious." He said, "Dad, that's genius. But are you sure?" I said, "Your grandfather used to say that a man's character is measured in what he does when he loses. I've been thinking about that a lot lately." Robbie was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Grandpa was a wise man." I said, "He was the wisest man I ever knew. Here is what nobody understood. Everyone assumed that because I was quiet, I was defeated. Everyone assumed that because I didn't argue or yell or throw things, I was broken." Margaret's lawyer sent over the settlement papers. They were breathtaking in their scope. Margaret was asking for the house on Crescent Lane, the 2019 Buick, the savings account $47,000, the lake cabin in Blue Ridge, half of my pension, half of my 401k, and I read every page, and I called my own lawyer. Now, this is important. I had consulted a lawyer. A very quiet, very sharp woman named Ellen Cho. Ellen Cho had been recommended to me by an old friend who said she was the best divorce attorney in the county. Not the loudest, not the most aggressive, the best. I told Ellen everything, and I showed her something. Something that nobody knew existed, but I'll get to that, because timing matters in a story, just like it matters in life. Ellen looked at all the papers Margaret's lawyer had filed. She looked at everything they were asking for, and she said to me, "Harold, I can fight all of this, every single item. We have grounds." I said, "I know." She said, "So what do you want me to do?" I said, "I want you to let them have it all." Ellen blinked, just once. Then she said, very carefully, "Harold, do you understand what you're saying?" I said, "Every word." She said, "They're asking for the house, the car, the savings, the cabin, significant portions of your retirement." I said, "I know what they're asking for, Ellen." She studied me for a long moment. And then, and I will never forget this, she leaned back in her chair and she said, "You know something they don't." I said, "Shall we go over the details?" And I slid a folder across the desk to her. She opened it. She read for about 4 minutes. Then she looked up at me and said, "Oh, Harold." I said, "Yes." She said, "They have absolutely no idea." I said, "Not the faintest." The day I signed the papers, Margaret was there with Clifford Wells. Gerald was not in the room. He had the decency to stay away. But I heard later that he was waiting outside in his car. Tommy was there. Diane was there. Margaret was smiling. Not a mean smile. Not exactly. More of a relieved smile. Like a woman who had been holding her breath and could finally exhale. Clifford Wells slid the papers across the table to me and said, in that loud, unnecessary voice of his, "Mr. Mercer, if you'd like to take a few minutes to review." I said, "I don't need a few minutes." I picked up the pen, and I signed, every page, every line, my name over and over. Harold James Mercer, Harold James Mercer, Harold James Mercer. Margaret's smile got wider with every signature. Tommy wouldn't quite meet my eyes, but Diane was watching my hand move across those papers, like she was watching a coronation. When I finished, I put the pen down. I stood up. I looked at Margaret, really looked at her, maybe the last time I would ever look at her that way, and I said, "I hope you're happy, Margaret. I truly do." She said, softly, "Harold, But Clifford Wells was already talking about next steps and timelines and the final hearing date, and the moment passed. I walked out of that office. I got into the car I had rented, because they had already taken the Buick, and I drove to Patricia's apartment. She opened the door, and she looked at me, and her eyes filled up immediately. She said, Dad, how are you?" I said, "I'm fine, Patty." She said, "You signed everything. You really signed everything?" I said, "I did." She said, "Dad," I said, "make me a cup of coffee and sit down with me. I want to tell you something." And I told her. She sat across from me at her little kitchen table, and her expression went through about 15 different things in the space of 10 minutes. Surprise, confusion, realization, and then, slowly, very slowly, she started to smile. She said, "Dad, you absolute genius." I said, "Language, Patricia." She laughed. For the first time in months, my daughter really laughed. Now, here is what nobody knew. 22 years ago, when I was doing home repair work on weekends, I was hired by a man named Douglas Garrett. Douglas Garrett owned 3 rental properties, and he needed significant work done on all of them. I spent almost a full year working for Douglas on weekends. We became friendly. Douglas was not a wealthy man by any public measure. He drove an old pickup truck and wore flannel shirts and ate sandwiches from a gas station. But Douglas was smart. He understood land. He understood property. When I finished the work on his 3rd property, Douglas sat me down and said, "Harold, I don't have enough cash to pay your full rate right now." I said, "Douglas, I trust you. Pay when you can." He said, "I want to offer you something instead. I've got 12 acres out on Millbrook Road, raw land, nothing on it. It's worth about as much as what I owe you, maybe a little more. I want you to take it in trade." I said, "Douglas, I don't know what I'd do with 12 acres of raw land." He said, "Nothing. You do nothing with it. You just hold it. And someday, Harold, someday it will matter." I thought about it for a week. Then I said yes. I put that 12 acres in my name alone, not jointly with Margaret, just mine. I paid the property taxes on it every year quietly, from a separate account Margaret didn't know about, not because I was hiding anything, but because we had always managed our accounts somewhat separately for business purposes, and it simply never came up. I held that land for 22 years. And then, 2 years before Margaret filed for divorce, 2 years, as if the universe were clearing its throat, a commercial development company approached every landowner on Millbrook Road. They were building a regional distribution hub. They needed land. They needed my land. 12 acres on Millbrook Road, which Douglas Garrett had traded me for labor when it was worth about $14,000, was now worth, and I want you to hear this clearly, $1.3 million, $1,300,000. And because it was in my name only, acquired before certain legal windows in the divorce proceedings, and because Ellen Cho was the sharpest attorney in the county, it was completely, entirely, legally mine, not subject to division, not on the settlement papers, not even on Clifford Wells' radar. I want to pause here because I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Harold, why didn't you just tell Margaret? Why didn't you fight for the house, take your half of everything, and keep the land money? And the answer is this: I could have. Ellen told me I could have. We could have fought the settlement, and I likely would have kept the house and received a more equitable split. But here's what I understood that nobody else did. Margaret had chosen Gerald. Margaret had chosen a life without me. And that was her right. That broke my heart in ways I still can't fully put into words, even now. But the house, my house, the house I built, I didn't want to fight over it. I didn't want to win it in a courtroom, while my wife and my son sat across from me with their lawyers. My father's voice kept coming back to me. A man's character is measured in what he does when he loses. I wasn't losing, but I was letting them believe I was, because I had learned something in 67 years of living. I had learned that the people who grab and snatch and demand and take, they never really end up with what they wanted. They end up with things, just things, and things don't keep you warm at night. Things don't hold your hand. Things don't forgive you. I signed those papers because I was done fighting, done carrying the weight of a marriage that had become hollow, done being the old mechanic who smelled like motor oil and didn't fit into his daughter-in-law's picture of a successful family. I signed those papers because I already had everything I needed. The final divorce hearing was scheduled for a Thursday morning in November. Robbie flew in from Oregon. He stayed at Patricia's apartment. Patricia told him everything, and he called me the night before and said, "Dad, I wish I could have been there through all of this." I said, "You're here now." He said, "Can I come tomorrow to the hearing?" I said, "I would love that, son." So it was the three of us, me and Patricia and Robbie, who walked into that courthouse on a cold November morning. And across the lobby, I saw Margaret. She was with Clifford Wells. She was dressed nicely. She always dressed nicely. And Gerald was there this time, standing slightly behind her, like he was already learning his place in her new life. He was maybe 10 years younger than me, taller, better dressed. He looked at me with the careful, neutral expression of a man who knows he has taken something from someone and hasn't decided yet how to feel about it. I nodded at him, just a nod, no malice, no performance. He looked away first. Tommy and Diane arrived a few minutes later. Diane looked at me and then at Patricia and Robbie and did that calculation that Diane was always doing, figuring out what the presence of people meant, what it signaled. She whispered something to Tommy. Tommy came over to me. He stood in front of me, and he looked like he wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. He said, "Dad." I said, "Tommy." He said, "You doing okay?" I said, "I'm fine, son. How are the grandkids?" He blinked. Like he hadn't expected me to ask about the grandkids. Like he had been prepared for anger and didn't know what to do with gentleness. He said, "They're good. Emma lost another tooth." I said, "Tell her grandpa says congratulations," and I walked into the courtroom. The hearing itself was procedural, papers reviewed, assets confirmed. The judge, a quiet, efficient woman named Judge Harriet Moore, went through everything methodically. Margaret sat at her table with Clifford Wells, and every time Judge Moore confirmed another item, the house, the car, the savings, Margaret's posture relaxed a little more. Her shoulders came down. A small smile played at the corner of her mouth, the smile of a woman who believed she had won. I sat at my table with Ellen Cho. I sat very still. My hands were folded on the table in front of me. Patricia and Robbie were in the gallery behind me, and I could feel them back there, and it steadied me. Judge Moore went through the full settlement. She confirmed each asset. She looked at both attorneys. She said, "Is there anything else to be entered into the record before I finalize?" Clifford Wells said, "Nothing from the petitioner, Your Honor." Ellen Cho said, "Actually, Your Honor, there is one item. And here is the moment. Here is the moment I want you to picture." Clifford Wells looked up. Margaret looked up. Her smile, that small, satisfied smile, shifted, just slightly. a shadow crossing a face. Ellen Cho stood up and she said, "Your Honor, the respondent, Harold James Mercer, holds sole title to a parcel of land located at 4400 Millbrook Road, comprising 12 acres. This property was acquired by Mr. Mercer 2 years ago as payment for services rendered, held in his name alone, and as it meets the criteria for separate property under state law, it is not subject to division. In these proceedings, we are entering documentation of the recent appraisal and the executed sale agreement for this property, which Mr. Mercer entered into prior to the filing of these divorce proceedings." She slid the documents across to the court clerk. Judge Moore looked at them, and she said, "Counsel, what is the value of this sale?" Ellen said, $1,300,000, Your Honor. The courtroom went very quiet. I did not look at Margaret. I kept my eyes forward, but I heard it. I heard the sound, a small, sharp intake of breath, and then the silence that followed it. I heard Clifford Wells say, in a low, urgent voice, "Margaret." And I heard Margaret say, in a voice that was suddenly very small, "I didn't know about any land." Judge Moore reviewed the documents. She asked Ellen several questions. Ellen answered each one calmly, precisely, in that way of hers. And then Judge Moore said, "The court confirms that the property at 4400 Millbrook Road constitutes separate property of the respondent and is excluded from the marital estate. The sale proceeds belong entirely to Harold James Mercer." She set down the documents. She looked at both tables. She said, "Is there anything further?" Silence. Then this court finalizes the dissolution of this marriage, as agreed upon by both parties in the settlement. She signed. The gavel came down, and it was over. I stood up slowly. My back still gives me trouble in the cold, and November courtrooms are always cold. Patricia was beside me immediately, her hand on my arm. Robbie was on my other side. I turned around. Margaret was standing at her table. Clifford Wells was talking to her fast, low words, and she wasn't listening to him. She was looking at me, and the expression on her face was something I will carry with me for the rest of my life. It wasn't anger. It wasn't jealousy, not exactly. It was realization. Pure, clean, awful realization. The look of a person who has just understood something too late. Gerald had his hand on her shoulder, and she didn't seem to notice it was there. Tommy was standing in the gallery. Diane was next to him, and for once, for maybe the first time I had ever witnessed, Diane had no expression on her face at all. Her face was simply blank. Because Diane's whole vocabulary was written in property values and status and money, and she had just watched a man she had dismissed as a finished old mechanic walk out of a courtroom with more money than she made in a decade. Tommy's face broke my heart all over again, but differently this time, because I could see that he was ashamed, not of me, of himself. And I knew my son well enough to know that shame like that goes deep, and it changes a person. And that was both a sad thing and a necessary thing. Margaret took a step toward me. Clifford Wells said something, and she waved her hand at him, and she took another step. She said, "Harold." I said, "Margaret." She said, "I didn't know about the land." I said, "I know you didn't." She said, "If I had known." I said gently, "Margaret, it wouldn't have changed anything. You still wanted the divorce, and you were right to want it. We hadn't been happy in a long time. I know that now." Her eyes filled up. She said, "I thought you had nothing." I said, "I know." She said, I thought you'd beat." I said, "Broken, finished." I shook my head. "Margaret, I am my father's son. I have never been finished." She looked at me for a long moment, and then she said, quietly, so quietly that only I could hear it, "I'm sorry, Harold. I'm sorry for a lot of things." I looked at this woman I had loved for 41 years. This woman I had built a house for. This woman who had stood in the rain at her mother's backyard and laughed and said that rain was good luck. I said, "I forgive you, Margaret." And I meant it. I truly meant it. because carrying a grudge is heavy, and I was done carrying heavy things. Out in the hallway, Tommy was waiting. Diane was not with him. I don't know where she went. Maybe she needed some air. Maybe she needed to think. Tommy stood in front of me, and this time he found the words. He said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I looked at my son. My 40-year-old son who had once handed me screwdrivers on Saturday mornings and fallen asleep in my recliner watching baseball games and cried when his grandmother died and called me from hospital at 2 in the morning when Diane was in labor because he was scared, and I was the person he called when he was scared. I said, "I know you are." He said, "I should have been on your side through all of this. I should have." I said, "Tommy, come here." And I put my arms around my son, my 40-year-old son, and he stood there for a second like he'd forgotten how to do this, and then he hugged me back. Hard, like a man holding on to something he thought he'd let go of too long ago. He said, muffled, "I'm sorry, Dad." I said, "I know, son. I know." Patricia was crying. She's always been the crier. Robbie had his arm around her, and he was blinking fast, the way men do when they're trying not to cry. I looked at my 3 children in that courthouse hallway, and I thought, whatever else happens, whatever was taken, whatever broke, these 3 people are still mine, and I am still theirs. That is worth more than 12 acres. That is worth more than $1 million. I'll tell you the rest quickly, because I think you understand by now what kind of man I am and what kind of story this is. I bought a small house, not a big one, 3 bedrooms, a workshop in the back, a covered porch where I can sit in the evening with my coffee. Patricia helped me pick it out. She has good taste, she always did. I set up a college fund for each of my grandchildren, all 8 of them, including Tommy's kids, including Emma, who had just lost another tooth. Because my grandchildren did nothing wrong, and they are innocent in all of this, and their grandfather loves them completely. I gave a portion of the land money to Robbie, not because he needed it, but because he had been loyal and kind throughout, and I wanted him to know I saw that. I paid off Patricia's car and her apartment for a year, so she could breathe a little easier. She cried about that for about 15 minutes, and then she made me dinner, and we sat at her table and talked until midnight, and it was one of the best nights I can remember. And I kept enough for myself to live well, not extravagantly, but well for the rest of my life, to travel a little, to sit on my porch, to fix things that need fixing, because some habits are not habits at all, but simply who you are. Diane came to see me about 3 weeks after the hearing. She came alone, no Tommy. Just Diane in her nice car, standing at the door of my new small house, looking like a woman who had rehearsed what she was going to say and then forgot it all. She said, "Harold, I owe you an apology." I said, "Come in, I'll make coffee." She sat at my kitchen table, and she looked around at my small, clean house, and I think she expected to feel superior, and found that she didn't. She said, "I treated you like you didn't matter, like you were just in the way." I said, "Yes, you did." She blinked. I think she expected me to say, "Oh, no, Diane, don't worry about it." I said, "But I understand where it came from. You wanted Tommy to be successful. You wanted your life to look a certain way, and I was a mechanic with dirty hands and a house that wasn't modern enough, and I didn't fit your picture. I understand that. I don't agree with it, but I understand it." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "He missed you. Tommy missed you, even when he was pulling away. He just didn't know how to." I said, "I know. He's my son. I know him." She said, "Will you come to dinner? Sunday dinner. The kids have been asking about Grandpa Harold." I said, "Tell Emma I want to see that gap in her teeth." Diane smiled. Not the Diane smile I was used to, the calculating one, the social one, a real smile, small and a little ashamed and real. "Sunday at 6, she said. "I'll bring pie." I said, "I want to talk to you now directly, not as a character in a story. As Harold, just Harold. I am 67 years old. I have worked with my hands my whole life. I have built things and fixed things, and I have been underestimated in boardrooms and courtrooms and at Diane's dinner table, and it has never once been the worst thing that happened to me. The worst thing that happened to me was believing that love was something I could build once and leave standing without tending to it. Marriage is not a house. You cannot build it with your hands and walk away and expect it to stand. You have to live in it. You have to be present in it, and I was not always present. I was providing. There is a difference, and I learned it too late. That is my honest accounting of my own failures, but I also want to say this. There are people in your life, maybe in your family, maybe in your home, who are quiet, who don't fight back, who don't make speeches or demand credit or pound the table. People who just work, just give, just build. Do not mistake their silence for weakness. Do not mistake their patience for ignorance. Do not mistake their calm for surrender. Because the people who have truly lived, who have worked with their hands and carried heavy things and gotten up again and again, they are not afraid of loss. They have lost before. They know what comes after loss. They know that what remains is what matters. My father was right. A man's character is not measured in what he gains. It is measured in what he does when he loses. And when I lost, when I sat at that table and signed my name across those papers, I was not losing at all. I was becoming, fully and finally, exactly who my father raised me to be. A man who knows that dignity cannot be taken, that integrity cannot be divided in a court of law, that love, real love, patient love, the love of a father for his children and his children's children, is the one asset that no lawyer can put on a settlement sheet. They took the house, but I still had the memories of building it. They took the car, but I still had every mile I drove my children to their schools and their games and their futures. They took the savings, but I had built something worth far more, quietly, over 22 years, without asking for recognition or applause. And in the end, in that cold November courtroom, when the gavel came down, I walked out with everything that mattered. To anyone watching this who is going through something hard, a divorce, a betrayal, a family that has turned its back, I want you to hear me. Stay quiet, stay dignified, keep building, keep knowing your worth even when no one else does, because your story is not over. The gavel hasn't come down yet. And when it does, when your moment comes, the people who dismissed you will remember exactly who they underestimated. And you will walk out of that room with your head up, just like I did. My name is Harold James Mercer. I am 67 years old. I still fix things. I still drink coffee on my porch in the morning. I still miss the house I built on Crescent Lane sometimes, when the light is right and the air smells like November. But I am not broken. I was never broken, and neither are you. If this story moved you, if Harold's quiet strength said something to your heart, please give this video a like, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel so you never miss a story that reminds you what truly matters in this life. Leave a comment below. What would you have done in Harold's place? I read every single one. Thank you for watching. And remember, the quietest person in the room is often the one holding all the cards.